welcome to the Deep Dive. Our investigation today, it takes us into territory that is fundamentally different from the corporate dramas we usually track.
It really is.
We're not examining a market failure, or some big public scandal that you'd see on the front pages.
No.
We're looking at a vacuum, an absolute void in the official record where a major infrastructural player once stood.
And that procedural anomaly is really the core of what we're looking at today. We're talking about a corporate entity whose disappearance, it actively defied the standard conventions of public record keeping, the mandated ones.
Right, so this wasn't a company that just liquidated or was purchased in a normal way.
Not at all. The evidence suggests it was systematically, deliberately, and almost surgically erased from public view.
And the subject of this deep dive is a technology firm. A kind of quiet giant that operated for years in the most critical, but also the least visible sectors of our national infrastructure.
Foundational. It was foundational to how major state systems operate.
Indispensable, you could say.
Yeah.
And yet, somewhere along the timeline, it ceased to exist. And it left behind not a single public filing, no regulatory notice, nothing to mark its passing.
So the central mystery for us is one of governance and accountability. How can a firm that is so integral to the continuous function of government, of essential services, simply stop existing in the public domain?
What are the mechanisms that even allow that? For a massive infrastructure provider to just leave behind an absence while its vital work somehow continues?
Right, uninterrupted.
So our mission today is to act, really, as forensic historians. We have to meticulously track the timeline of its quiet existence, and then its abrupt, silent removal. We need to highlight the specific documentation that went missing, the decisions that remain completely unexplained, and the questions that just hover over this whole vanishing act.
It's an investigation into the history of silence.
It is, and it forces us to ask a bigger question. If an essential part of the nation's technological backbone can be removed without any public knowledge, how much of our critical infrastructure is truly transparent? Let's unpack this history.
To really understand the implications of this firm's removal, we have to first establish the gravity of its operational profile.
Sure.
We are not discussing some volatile tech startup, the kind that gets a huge valuation and then just collapses under its own weight. This firm, it was established in the early 2000s, and it was a model of steady, long-term, deliberate operation.
And if you track their financial footprint, you can see that. In the years right up to the erasure, the trajectory is just stability. Their growth was not explosive, it was calculated.
Completely, and it was focused entirely on cultivating these deep, long-standing contracts, not on attracting venture capital or public market attention.
So their business model was essentially to be the least newsworthy, most boring company in their sector.
Exactly. That lack of fanfare was fundamentally their core operational strategy.
Which brings us to the nature of their service, this unseen service. Most people think of infrastructure as physical things, bridges, power grids.
Fiber optic lines, sure. But this firm specialized in the technology that manages and secures those assets. They were operating deep inside the control layer.
Can you elaborate on that? When we say backend systems, what does that actually look like in the context of national services?
It means they were operating at the level where failure is catastrophic. We're talking about critical control systems. So, for instance, their work involved sophisticated data management architectures, the kind designed to handle these immense constant streams of sensitive information.
Okay.
They provided infrastructure support, often dealing with highly specialized industrial control mechanisms, things governed by SCADA protocols, that supervisory control and data acquisition.
SCADA.
Yeah.
And what does that manage?
It manages real-time processes for utilities, for power generation, transportation networks, the really critical stuff.
So if a metropolitan transit system, for example, needs to ensure that all of its signaling and power distribution are perfectly synchronized across hundreds of miles of track.
That foundational technological synchronization, that was their product.
Right.
And their specialization also went into complex security integration. This involved designing, maintaining proprietary network protocols, implementing advanced access control layers. They manage things like large-scale zero-trust network architectures for government agencies.
So we're not talking about just securing a website.
No, not at all. They were securing the nervous system that runs essential public services. Their product wasn't hardware or software you could buy in a box. It was sheer, uninterrupted, foundational reliability.
To get to that level of indispensability, they had what you're calling a strategic framework. the cultivation of silence. How rigorous was this policy of avoiding a public presence?
It was absolute. We found evidence of a dedicated internal mandate that was focused on, well, on opacity.
So what did that mean in practice?
It meant zero public-facing advertising. If they had marketing materials at all, they were only distributed within these very close circles of government procurement officers and high-level defense strategists.
No interviews with executives.
None. The firm actively steered clear of any kind of corporate profile that might attract attention, from the media, from financial analysts, or critically, from competitors.
You see that level of secrecy with some defense contractors, of course, but usually that invisibility is mandated because of classification.
Right.
For a non-classified infrastructure firm, maintaining that kind of silence requires an active, ongoing effort. And frankly, it costs money. They weren't just hiding, they were paying to stay invisible.
Absolutely. Think about the cost of not participating in standard industry conferences or avoiding the major trade publications. It limits your market reach, but it guarantees operational security and discretion. This strategy was entirely designed to facilitate that deep integration with their client base without ever creating a need for public explanation.
Or accountability.
For accountability.
And this client base, it really underscores the firm's true gravity. They weren't selling software to, local businesses. They are interwoven with the very structure of the state.
Their clients included major federal government agencies, large state-level public institutions, mass transit authorities, departments tied directly to national infrastructure, and the security apparatus.
And because their work involved that foundational data management, that security integration into systems running on, say, real-time risk auditing.
The level of security clearance required was immense. They weren't just external vendors, they were embedded partners. They were sitting on sensitive network architecture diagrams. They were potentially holding the keys to system continuity.
The sources confirm this. This level of reliance was much greater than what was ever acknowledged publicly. This quiet, unadmitted dependency on a low-profile firm, it becomes the central vulnerability.
Yes. It sets the stage for the silent erasure. They created an operational environment where just acknowledging their existence became a greater risk than ensuring their disappearance.
It suggests that for years, the need for deep integration and that specialized expertise, it just trumped the public's right to know who controls the nation's technological backbone.
They cultivated a reliance that made them both indispensable and ultimately impossible to publicly dissolve.
So we have this picture, a stable, utterly discrete entity performing critical work for the government with what seems like complete assurance of continued business. Let's look at that operational period right before everything changed. For years, the firm functioned with this uninterrupted stability.
And that operational stability is crucial context. For years, the work just continued. No interruptions. The contracts were consistently renewed.
So if you were, say, a mid-level manager at one of the government agencies they service,
you would have no reason to suspect any forthcoming change. The invoicing was regular, the security audits were routine, the performance benchmarks were consistently met, everything was normal.
From any external viewpoint, there was zero indication of a transition or any trouble. It's like tracking a satellite. Steady velocity, predictable orbit. Nothing suggests a sudden course correction, let alone integration.
And this stability contrasts so sharply with the end result. It highlights the extraordinary nature of government contracting. Federal or state contracts, particularly the ones touching national infrastructure, are traditionally subject to these rigorous review cycles.
Right. Competitive bidding, mandatory public announcements.
All of it, usually through vehicles like the Federal Business Opportunities website or, equivalent state procurement portals.
So the fact that this firm's contracts were so consistently and uninterruptedly renewed implies a few possibilities, and none of them are standard.
Well, either they were perpetually successful in open bidding, which is highly unlikely for these complex niche proprietary systems, or they were classified as a sole source provider.
Meaning the government just decided no other company could do the job without causing unacceptable disruption.
Precisely. And that latter scenario suggests a level of vendor lock-in that it borders on critical dependency. If they were a sole source provider, their performance has to meet exacting standards. But more importantly, their continued operation is mandated by systemic necessity.
Which is why the expected trail of public records, which should be extensive for a company like this, stands in such stark contrast to the reality we uncovered.
The difference is night and day.
So let's define that expected trail. If you operate in this space, What is the mandatory paperwork or public footprint that should exist?
Oh, the requirements are massive. Any company receiving significant federal or state revenue has to file public contract awards. They have to detail the scope of work, the funding allocation.
There would be financial filings.
Yes, financial filings, often tied to specific regulatory compliance documents about IT security standards or critical infrastructure protection, like the NRC CIP standards for the energy sector.
And even if those documents are heavily redacted for security reasons?
Even then, the fact of their existence, the dates of contract renewal, the general scope that, by law, has to enter the public domain.
Yet we find that this firm, even before its removal, had perfected this art of having a minimal public footprint while maximizing its governmental integration.
It suggests a very proactive, very successful strategy to operate just at the periphery of mandatory transparency.
And this quiet reliance? This was the key that allowed for the silent removal.
It was the key facilitator. When the government relies implicitly on a single provider for its deepest backend systems that simply cannot fail, the transition or removal of that provider is elevated. It goes from being a public finance matter to a national security sensitivity.
So the reliance itself became a kind of administrative Achilles heel. If they had followed standard protocol, a public request for a proposal, a managed transition, a 6-month wind down,
it would have risked exposing the specific critical vulnerabilities that this firm was managing.
Exactly. The sheer magnitude of their integration, coupled with the sensitivity of their work managing SCADA systems or zero-trust architecture for major agencies, it meant that the necessity of operational continuity just overwhelmed the demands of public accountability.
Transparency was sacrificed long before the firm actually vanished. It prepared the ground for an administratively smooth but publicly invisible exit. We're looking at a calculated decision to manage risk through absolute opacity.
Which brings us to the critical pivot point in the timeline. The event itself, the moment of abrupt change, the stability we just discussed, it shattered and the company was removed. And this is where the distinction is vital. What did not happen tells us more than what did.
The sources are very clear on this. This was not a typical corporate departure. It was not a voluntary shutdown under Chapter 7 or Chapter 11 bankruptcy.
Which would have required extensive public court filings.
Absolutely. And crucially, it was not an acquisition, not through a standard M&A process, which would trigger mandatory filings with bodies like the SEC or similar state-level corporate registries.
So to be removed or erased, that implies an active, deliberate action. One executed outside the standard heavily documented legal processes.
It suggests a surgical extraction, one managed either internally by the firm's own leadership or perhaps externally by its very powerful client base.
And the first visible signs of this operation were purely digital. The Vanishing Act didn't start with an announcement. It started with broken links.
Yes, we tracked the timeline of the digital erasure through these procurement databases.
And you have to think about those systems, these labyrinthine procurement systems that government agencies maintain. Every contract, every vendor ID number, every performance evaluation, it's all cross-referenced in these sprawling, interlocking databases.
They're supposed to be permanent, granite markers of public expenditure and accountability.
And yet,
references to this specific company were systematically removed from those central procurement databases. This is a massive coordinated administrative effort. It's not a passive deletion. It requires high-level authority to mandate and execute the removal of data that is legally required to exist in perpetuity.
On top of that, archived contract pages, which are supposed to be immutable for years, they just started to stop loading entirely. And even the minimal press mentions the firm had gathered over 2 decades. Innocuous notices about opening a local office or getting a specialized clearance, they simply vanished from the searchable public record.
It's the digital equivalent of sandblasting a historical marker. It implies resources and intent far beyond a standard corporate winding down. We are looking at a deliberate manipulation of the public electronic record to achieve functional historical negation.
And what about the human element in all this? The disappearance wasn't flagged by the public or the media. The first definitive confirmation came from inside, from former employees.
And this is such a powerful signal of the sheer lack of public notification. Employees suddenly found their access just severed. Professional work emails, which would contain years of sensitive communications and foundational operational knowledge, were deactivated. Not gradually phased out, but cut off. Immediately.
Just imagine that. Logging in on a Monday morning and finding that your entire digital identity, the repository of your life's work on critical national systems, has simply ceased to exist.
And the internal portals, the crucial access points for managing these national infrastructure projects, they just went dark.
And this all happened without the standard procedural signals that are required under labor laws for large-scale corporate closures.
No public redundancy announcements, no mass layoff warnings. And most critically, no subsequent public statement was ever issued explaining the closure or the transition of personnel or the status of these ongoing critical projects.
The implication there is that the employees themselves were seen as information security risks.
That's right.
They were cut off immediately, prioritizing the cessation of their access to sensitive systems over standard HR protocols. It suggests the whole operation was designed for maximum speed and minimal internal communication, let alone external.
The mechanics of this erasure were thorough, immediate, and utterly silent to the outside world. The sheer scale of that silence, immediately following years of stable, critical operation, makes this event a true outlier in modern corporate history.
Let's focus intently now on the void that was created by this silent operation. As we've emphasized, the very nature of this firm's work demanded a public record trail, a paper trail. Yet that record is entirely absent. We really need to detail this missing documentation to appreciate the significance of the evasion.
We have to catalog this absence because it reveals the intent behind the operation. This isn't just missing paperwork. This is the deliberate bypassing of legal requirements, the ones designed to ensure corporate and public accountability.
So let's start with the standard exit rows. If a company fails financially, it files for bankruptcy. What documentation is required there that we now know is missing?
Okay, so if the firm had filed for Chapter 7, which is liquidation, or Chapter 11, reorganization, the filing would create a complete public record detailing the company's financial state. We would see the schedules of assets and liabilities, a comprehensive list of all creditors, detailed budgets, records of court proceedings.
The entire point is transparency for stakeholders.
Exactly. The complete lack of any bankruptcy filing means the firm was removed without any public accounting for its debts, its assets, or its ongoing commitments.
So who got paid? Who got left behind? What happened to all the intellectual property and that specialized hardware? Legally, that information should be visible through the court system, but in this case, it's just a blank page.
It is a blank page. Now let's look at the acquisition route. Had they been acquired, whether by a major competitor or a defense firm, mandatory disclosure filings would have been required. If the company was large enough, or if the acquirer was a public company, we would see an SEC Form 8K. That would detail the change in control, the value of the transaction, the transfer of critical assets.
And even for a private sale.
Even for a private sale, state corporate registries would require updated documentation confirming the change in corporate ownership structure. None of this exists.
So the absence of an acquisition filing means that whatever legal mechanism was used to transfer those critical assets and contracts, it was structured specifically to be administratively invisible. It was designed to bypass standard M&A oversight.
Correct. And then finally, there's just the basic closure notice. Even the simplest business closing down needs to file an official notice with the relevant state or federal regulatory body to formally cease operations. This firm left no official closure notice,
which suggests its legal status is still in some kind of undefined limbo, or it was extinguished via an administrative decree that has not been made public.
And the combined absence of all these records, it implies the operation was executed entirely outside the standard legal framework for corporate transition. Someone or some entity had the authority to circumvent federal and state accountability mandates at the same time.
And this brings us to what you call the continuation paradox. This is the most crucial, unexplained element. The mission-critical work, the data management, the SCADA system security, the infrastructure support, it did not stop.
It couldn't stop. The national systems that relied on this firm could not afford even a momentary disruption.
So how was that continuity achieved? The specific details we've managed to piece together point to an instantaneous migration. Some contracts, which should have triggered months of public rebidding and transparency hearings, appeared to continue without any interruption. The only change was the name of the company doing the work.
The contracts were executed under different successor corporate names. This implies an incredibly meticulous pre-planning phase. Standard government contract transfer, or novation, requires months of public justification, financial review, and approval.
To make sure the new entity is capable and solvent.
Of course. The seamless nature of this transition suggests that the successor corporate names were ready and waiting. They likely possessed the exact same security clearances, the same technical personnel. It implies they were either newly created shell corporations or pre-existing, deeply embedded subsidiaries of a larger entity.
This speed, the simultaneous and invisible shift of high-security contracts, is a physical marker of the deliberate removal operation. The company's identity was eradicated, but its functional role in the infrastructure persisted. It was migrated instantly to a new administrative shell designed to ensure anonymity.
And that kind of effort to maintain continuity while ensuring invisibility, it necessitated the ultimate operational control mechanism, the shield of silence.
And this shield was enforced across multiple vectors. We know that former executives, when they were approached by industry observers, they declined all interviews. They adhered strictly to a coordinated strategy to avoid scrutiny.
More significantly, the employees themselves were rigorously bound by non-disclosure agreements. And sources indicate these NDAs went far beyond the standard confidentiality clauses about client data.
So they weren't just about protecting trade secrets.
No. These NDAs appear to specifically cover the circumstances of the firm's sudden disappearance, the mechanism of the asset transfer, and the identity of the successor companies. This legal blockade ensures that the only witnesses to the erasure are legally barred from ever speaking publicly about it.
And finally, the status of the firm's official documents. They're now either restricted or they remain incomplete, which makes any investigation using standard tools like a Freedom of Information Act request nearly impossible.
The operational choice was clear: to prioritize the integrity of the silence over any pretense of public accountability or historical record-keeping. The silence isn't passive, it is an actively maintained defense.
So given the systematic digital erasure and this official documentation void, researchers, analysts like yourself, you're left with this challenging work of just piecing together fragments. This is what you call the trail of absence.
It's an investigative nightmare. You're forced to rely on outdated third-party databases, archived local municipal reports, maybe old utility permits or property tax records, or specialized industry reports that predate the systematic cleanup.
The deliberate removal of that necessary connective tissue, the official filings, it turns historical tracking into a kind of forensic archaeology.
And it creates a unique contrast with typical corporate failures. When a standard company collapses, it creates a lot of financial and legal noise. You see litigation, angry creditors, public regulatory action, extensive media coverage of the fallout. This firm left a profound, calculated absence. A silence so effective that it swallowed the entire history of its own removal.
Making its non-existence its most defining feature.
Exactly. And within these sensitive sectors tied to national infrastructure, the significance of that achieved silence just cannot be overstated. If a public company fails, the market demands an explanation. If an infrastructure provider vanishes, we have to infer that the removal was designed precisely to raise fewer questions than any form of public acknowledgement would have.
The underlying implication being that whatever the catalyst was for the removal, be it a technical failure, a security compromise, an administrative restructuring, the details were deemed so sensitive that the controlling entities opted for complete systemic erasure.
Right. Rather than managing any kind of public narrative, the risk mitigation strategy was total information control.
Since the official record is empty, we have to rely on insight from, and critically, the unverified explanations circulating among industry insiders. These are professionals who work in adjacent, highly secretive fields of defense contracting and government IT.
And it is essential to treat these accounts strictly as theories. They're designed to fill a documented void, but they offer the only possible scenarios that explain the mechanics we've observed. And there are primarily two major currents circulating among these insiders.
Okay, what's Theory A?
Theory A suggests the firm was quietly absorbed into a larger, established defense contractor, or a highly specialized holding company. This theory best explains the seamless migration of contracts and the continuation of the work under those successor corporate names.
So if Theory A is true,
if it's true, the acquiring contractor successfully petitioned or was perhaps directed by the government to use classified or highly restricted procedures to avoid public disclosure. The rationale would be that disclosing the assets, the specific software, the network architecture, the personnel, would itself constitute a national security risk.
so the acquisition became a classified asset transfer.
Essentially, yes. The firm's liabilities were quietly resolved, And the assets were internalized into a larger operational structure, shielded from all public scrutiny.
That would require incredibly high-level approval, the kind of administrative power that could just override standard SEC and state regulatory requirements by citing national security exemptions.
It would. Then there's Theory B. This theory posits the disappearance was a mandated restructuring action, one driven by pressure from government regulators.
How so?
Perhaps the firm, despite its stability, grew to be a single point of failure. It may have suffered an internal security breach that was never disclosed. Or perhaps its proprietary technology created an unacceptable concentration of risk for a critical service.
So in that scenario, regulators might have mandated the complete dissolution of the existing legal entity to mitigate that systemic risk, transferring its assets and personnel under new, heavily monitored umbrellas.
Correct. The imperative here is still silence, but the driving force is a regulatory mandate to prevent systemic collapse or to prevent public panic over exposed vulnerabilities.
And regardless of the underlying trigger, whether it was a strategic M&A move shrouded in secrecy like in Theory A, or a forced regulatory intervention like in Theory B.
All the insider accounts converge on one essential confirmed fact. The entire transition happened entirely out of public view.
Zero press releases.
None.
Zero public questions asked by media or oversight committees, because the initial public trigger for those questions never materialized.
And zero external scrutiny. This consensus confirms the success of the operational strategy to achieve complete and enduring erasure. It stands as a chilling example of a critical infrastructural piece being disassembled and reassigned without leaving any recognizable legal or historical footprint for the public to trace. So we've meticulously traced the trajectory of this firm, from its stable, quiet operation in the early 2000s, providing that essential proprietary reliability to national systems.
Right.
Through the period of intense, unadmitted governmental reliance to the abrupt surgical digital erasure marked by deactivated internal access and those failing archival links in government databases.
We've proven the reality of the continuation paradox.
Mm-hmm.
The work persisted, seamlessly substituted under new successor corporate names, even as the original company identity was completely eradicated.
And we've cataloged the critical missing documentation. No bankruptcy filing, no acquisition filing, and no official closure notice. It demonstrates a successful administrative bypass of accountability mandates.
Our final assessment of this historical gap, it remains challenging. The central facts that define the event, the official, verifiable reason for the removal, the precise legal and financial mechanism of the asset transfer, and the full extent of the firm's foundational operations are entirely missing from the public sphere.
It's a profound demonstration of successful operational invisibility, executed at the highest levels of governance and technology management.
But it leaves us with the most critical, unresolved questions. And these are implications that resonate far beyond the fate of a single corporation.
What is the demonstrated ability to erase a foundational infrastructure provider without a single public trace? Tell us about the ultimate control mechanisms governing our critical national systems.
Right. If key players who are integral to public safety and continuity can be dissolved silently, their history redacted, their contracts migrated seamlessly, it suggests the functional existence of a parallel system of administrative governance, one operating entirely outside the realm of public knowledge or democratic oversight.
And when essential knowledge about the management of foundational infrastructure, the systems that ensure our safety, our transport, our communication, is intentionally restricted or incomplete, how much of that system remains truly transparent?
And what information is deemed too sensitive, too precarious, to ever be allowed to enter the official public record? The kind of information whose absence enables such a clean, silent vanishing act. The documented evidence suggests that the boundaries of public accountability are far more pliable than we are often led to believe.